All right, my name is Dave Anders. I'm clinical director at On With Life, and I have the privilege of introducing Lindsay Vox Eldridge. Lindsay received her bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Iowa, followed by her master's from the University of Utah in clinical psychology with an emphasis in neuropsychology. Lindsay has been working with individuals with brain injury for 14 years, 8 of which have been at On With Life. So 10 of which have been On With Life. One of the, if not the, I think, coolest thing about Lindsay, in this field, we strive to work toward a transdisciplinary approach to rehabilitation, which essentially means that all individuals on the team share skills with the other specialists on the team. And having Lindsay on the team over the years, Lindsay is not just the person that you send individuals who have emotional challenges to so Lindsay can fix them so they can get on with therapy. Lindsay, in everything she does, in everything she says, she shares insights, she shares approaches, she shares beliefs in a way that allows the entire team to be psychologically fluent. And at the end of the day, that, I think, has brought some of the greatest benefit to our person served and our families. So with that, Lindsay.
I was told to get nice and close, so I'm gonna try to do this. Thank you, Dave. That was very, very kind. I also see why people are doing handheld a little bit. I might transition. We'll see. Too tall, or I'm too short. Okay, so, yep, I'm gonna do it. Welcome, everybody. I'm gonna talk to you today about a couple different things. So, namely, how to weather being a rehab provider, how to weather basically being in a helping profession of any sort, whether you necessarily work in rehab or don't. And really centering on a couple different topics, burnout, compassion, fatigue, and vicarious trauma. So first, I want to talk a little bit about my why, basically, how did I get to this topic? I think it's probably safe to say that this is an insufficiently sort of addressed or talked about topic as is. We probably should be always doing a better job of discussing it. However, I have to be honest that my choice of this topic was somewhat selfish. Let me advance here. Okay. And I apologize if you downloaded slides. There are some differences, not significant, but there's some. So, okay, so selfish topic. There were kind of a few different factors that coalesced during probably over the last year or several years that kind of led me to this presentation topic. First, I had recently experienced one of the most difficult and traumatic years of my personal life. Always a good way to start a conference, right? Promise it gets better from here. Secondly, I had last summer a significant kind of aha moment after seemingly kind of benign exchange after an art therapy session that we did at On With Life. And third, I think increasingly we've all kind of noticed the lingering effects and sort of depleted emotional tanks that have been associated with COVID. I certainly noticed that for myself and also for my colleagues. I think it's definitely something we're aware of at On With Life and have been talking about for several years now, and sort of what do we do about that and how do we course correct. If we kind of stop and think about it, I don't know that we've really fully rebounded yet from all of that. Probably anyone that's working in healthcare can sympathize with that. It was such a drain, such a trauma, such a depletion, right? It's just going to take it would take a heck of a lot of stability for a long period of time for us to really fill back up from that. That's not how life works, certainly not how rehab works. So if we think about sort of when people are coming to see us, and this is probably true for most of you guys as well, we are dealing with people that are ultimately experiencing the worst thing that's ever happened to them. That's probably true for about 95% of the people, I would say, that we work with. They say, and that's with a ton of life adversity before this, right? With all kinds of traumas and difficulties before this, and they still say this takes the cake. So we're seeing people at that absolutely most vulnerable time in their lives. And then during COVID, to see them be forcibly kept away from their support systems when they needed them the most, it was just tragic, right? Very tragic. Hard to watch, hard to feel okay with. And I think simultaneously, out of necessity, right, not without good reason, we also had to do a ton of shifting to medicalness. This kind of like higher emphasis on safety and isolation and illness and suspicion and apprehension. And again, this is out of necessity. We had to do those things, but that is highly discrepant from the kind of place that On With Life was before the pandemic, right? And still is in our bones and who we are. And again, I think we're doing an amazing job of talking about these things and course correcting. But pre-pandemic, right, we were focused on rehab, right? Rehabilitating, getting people better, getting people back out into their lives. Heavy emphasis on independence, right? On incorporation, trust, closeness, like literal physical closeness with people. Other person served, your nurses, your therapists, your CNAs, eating all meals with other people, person served families getting to know each other, like literally just very close relationships, right? And so you go from that to this, in this picture, hazmat suit bubble people, right? Thankfully, we have these three ladies are amazing and are rocking it well and making fun out of looking like this. But that's the way we existed for a long time, or various variations of that. Our person served went to literally like, I don't know what your face looks like, and I have to be kept here in this room for long periods of time without seeing many people at all. So just highly discrepant. Then, last, there have been kind of several notable tragedies that have happened at On With Life in the last few months, kind of in close proximity to one another. And I'm sure most of you in this room, this is true for you too, at On With Life, we deal with tragedy every day. I mean, that's in reality, that is what we're doing, right? But these instances were rare, unexpected, heartbreaking, and I think kind of hit a lot of us in the gut. So when the conference committee came to me and said, we want you to present on something related to mental health, I knew what I wanted to talk about. It was kind of an amorphous blob in my head of an idea, right? But I knew in my heart what I wanted to talk about. My significant reservation was, that it was still very much an amorphous blob. I didn't really know I didn't flesh any of this out, really. Number two was that I had never presented on this before, and I knew very, very little about this topic, except for my own experiences, really, and probably like a layperson's understanding of some of these concepts, right? So I did some research. I read 2 books. Talked to a lot of colleagues, but I think that in many ways, today we'll still feel kind of like we're only scratching the surface. And I hope I'm kind of learning along with you guys, frankly. I hope, though, I'm able to kind of give you some relevant nuggets and give you some good food for thought. So with that, okay, I referenced earlier that I had kind of an aha moment, and I want to give you a little more context for that. So I mentioned, actually I didn't mention this yet. I had the privilege of assisting Jean, our CEO, with her dissertation project last summer. This project was looking at art therapy as a medium to explore like self-identity and self-concept after injury or new condition, disease, disorder, whatever we want to call that. We did this with 2 groups of persons served. We did it both at a residential program, and then we also did an inpatient group. The project had persons served kind of conceptualize how they saw themselves pre-injury, how they saw themselves right now, kind of in the midst of all of this, of what they're going through, and then how they envisioned themselves in the future through various different artistic expression and artistic mediums in order to process that and explore that. Very cool project. One day on the day that we were exploring self-concept right now in their present for our inpatient group, it was just a particularly emotionally charged or heavy day. Just was. This picture here was made on that day by one of our inpatient persons served. It depicts her being separated and kind of kept from her home and her kids, her family, by a stop sign and a rather large red barrier there. And as you can see, all of them are crying. She was certainly crying as she painted this and as she talked about it afterwards and shared it with the group. She also wasn't the only person that was emotive during that session. Numerous members were. So as I said, it was just a heavier session that day. As we were cleaning up afterwards, Jean said to our music therapist and myself, "Gosh, how do you guys do it?" And she said it with a seriousness that even though we hadn't been talking about this prior, I thought I probably knew what she was referencing, right? I said, "What do you mean? How do we hold other people's pain?" And she said, "Yeah." I shared what insights I had at that time. I certainly acknowledge that it's very difficult. I talked about, healthy compartmentalization and boundaries and how that had changed for me over the years of working there, and I had developed more of that, this sort of separation, how do I emotionally put things where they need to go, kind of a thing. We finished packing up, cleaning up, said goodbye to each other, and I walked out of the room thinking, I didn't even think that was a very emotional session. I didn't even think that was a very emotional session. I didn't even think that was a very emotional session? What is up with that? For real, right? Obviously it was. You can look at, none of you are there, but you can look at that and know that it was obviously an emotional session. That is an emotional painting, right? And it was like I had noted the emotional content of the session, but I had felt almost nothing. And don't get me wrong, again, healthy compartmentalization is absolutely necessary. It is a good skill. You need that skill to successfully work in any amount of helping professions. And obviously, too, it's relevant to say that there's a difference in terms of like exposure to people's pain between what I do and what Jean does, right? I am a direct care staff. I work with individuals either one-on-one or in group settings every day where I'm inundated with that kind of stuff. And Jean has a 10,000-foot view that a CEO would need to have, right? And I would say, thankfully, for us, simultaneously has a really good pulse on the day-to-day direct care staff as well, or stuff as well. But certainly a difference in terms of exposure. So that's relevant to point out. But, this was different. I felt disconnected from the emotionality of the session, kind of unaware or no longer attuned. It wasn't like I recognized that this was, sad and difficult and had cognitively decided something to do with that or where to put that. It was like it just hadn't moved me much at all. Jean talked about feeling an emotional kind of hangover for a couple days after these sessions, most of them. And I had walked away that day from the most emotional session that we had had thus far, thinking, good session. Because people shared, right? They got in touch with things that are difficult for them, and that's always psychologically beneficial. So in that way, it was absolutely a good session. That's true. But the bigger part of this was that it honestly paled in comparison to the level of affect, emotional content, tragedy, heartbreak that I saw on a daily basis, right? For our person served and for our families. So what did that discrepancy mean? Over the next few days, it was a significant kind of sinking in that I was different than I used to be. And I wasn't sure what that meant, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. And the more that I thought about it, the more I discussed it, the more I asked friends and coworkers about it, the more I read about it, this really became my aha moment for my own compassion fatigue. Only took me almost 10 years to get there, but but I did finally realize it. So that gives you some context for sort of where I'm coming from. I want to talk about, before we get into the nitty-gritty of stuff, talk a little bit about my lens. Obviously, this is already laden with my lens. I'm talking about my own personal experiences heavily. But I'm approaching this topic, obviously, through my set of experiences. So I'm a healthcare provider. I work in a direct care position. I work in the context of rehabilitation, predominantly with brain injury, but also other neurological conditions. So I think it can seem like this information is kind of only relevant to those specific types of work. But this topic is really applicable to a wide range of professions and non-work settings, non-work experiences too. So for example, do we have any caregivers or family members in the audience? I never know like how many we have on a given day or given conference year, I suppose. Just a couple, okay. So for you guys, and then for all of you that work closely with family members, they are at tremendous risk. Families and caregivers are at tremendous risk for burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma, right? Even more so than us, arguably, probably as professionals. So I hope that everybody, no matter sort of what lens you're coming to this with, I hope everybody can kind of take some bits and pieces. Okay. So definitions first. Burnout. There's 3 components in the kind of traditional work-related definition that Freudenberger developed in the 70s. So he really was looking at burnout as a product of work only. The 3 kind of defining characteristics are emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, kind of separating yourself emotionally from your work, and decreased sense of accomplishment. I would say those things still hold up today, right, as being relevant to what burnout is and how we probably define it. However, we think about this much more comprehensively now in a much broader sense than just work, right? We say that we're burnt out about a variety of things in all kinds of different contexts. I think sort of a nice, like, simplistic, down and nitty-gritty kind of definition that Emily and Amelia Nagoski came up with. They wrote a book. I will reference that book highly throughout this talk. The book is Burnout, Unlocking the Stress Cycle, or Secrets to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. So they call this feeling overwhelmed and exhausted by everything you have to do while still worrying that you're not doing enough. Sounds kind of familiar, huh? So that's burnout. Compassion fatigue. This was first identified in nurses as the loss of the ability to nurture. And that was back in the 90s. Then there's been continuing research since then. Charles Figley is a famous traumatologist, and he called it the cost of caring. His kind of official definition of compassion fatigue is the deep physical, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion that can result from working day to day in an intense caregiving environment. How many of you do this? Work, live, or exist in an intense caregiving environment? Show me your hands. How many of you do that? Most people in the room. Most people. Okay. A key feature, as its name would suggest, not surprisingly, is that there's a diminished ability or diminished capability to feel compassion for others. It's kind of blunted or taken away entirely. Okay. Last one, vicarious trauma. This was originally conceptualized within psychotherapeutic relationships only. So any kind of psychological professional that was working with trauma survivors is how it was originally thought of. But over the years, it has come to be applied to, in much broader terms. Now we really apply it to nearly anybody who is heavily exposed to secondary trauma, whether that's professionally or personally. I'm going to read some of these definitions. Apologies for, I dropped something, but I don't know what it was. I think a water bottle went down. When a person, particularly a health professional, experiences a profound shift in worldview, spirituality, or self-identity due to empathetic bonding while being exposed to another person's trauma. So it's this idea that I connect with you and therefore I am impacted by your trauma, right? The bonding part or the empathy part is important. It's thought that this is kind of a cumulative, sort of slow, cumulative, transformative kind of impact is generally how it's thought of. Simplistically put, it's sort of being traumatized or negatively impacted by other people's trauma, or as I like to term it, the trauma trickle down. Sometimes compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, and then this other term called secondary traumatic stress are used interchangeably. I would say don't get too bogged down. If you love construct conceptualization and things like that, like what features of this is this and not that, then go for it. You can scour the literature. But I think for the purposes of this talk, right, these things have a ton of overlap with one another. They both have a lot of overlap, and they also do individually have some unique features of them, but I'm not going to get too hung up on that. So, okay, next one here. We're going to talk a little bit about this thing called human giver syndrome. So this originated basically with Kate Mann. She wrote a book in which she distinguished human beings from human givers. This is probably going to be new for a lot of you unless you've read the book, but it is a distinction within that book. I will kind of briefly explain. So she sort of illustrates that some people are out there in the world, human beings are out there in the world kind of tasked with accomplishing, right? Being out there, succeeding, going, doing, getting, maximizing their sort of human potential. Human givers, on the opposite end, have this sort of moral obligation to give their humanity. So rather than maximizing my humanity, succeeding in whatever capacity I can and as much as I can out in the world, I am the opposite of the human giver is to give of myself, give my humanity away to others. That includes all kinds of things, time, attention, love, maybe their aspirations, really kind of giving even at extremes of their lives, right, in service of doing for other people. So then we have the Nagoski sisters that I already mentioned. They took that concept and kind of broadened it or kind of ran with it and talk about something called human giver syndrome, which is essentially the false kind of contagious belief that women have a moral obligation to be pretty, happy, calm, generous, and attentive to the needs of others. This is very gendered, obviously, and both books point out that certainly human giver syndrome can be applicable to men as well. It's just that women are at higher likelihood of this, and certainly like societally more set up for this kind of expectation. So it's basically, I think of it as kind of all of those shoulds, right, that we have. Health and giving professions are particularly susceptible to those kinds of shoulds, right? The needs, this kind of idea that the needs of others come before my own always, and that's how it should be. A broader kind of definition here that I think, again, is less gendered and maybe just broader. The false belief that some people are expected to pervasively give of themselves, really sacrifice themselves in service of others. It's often associated with this idea that it's justifiable to do that because caring for others is the ultimate benevolence, right? It's selfless, it's virtuous, and has inherent purpose. And for some, it does. And for others, it doesn't, right? For me, it does. Helping others is the purpose that keeps me going. It's the thing that fills me up most, probably. It gives me warm fuzzies. We all know, hopefully, what that feels like. It makes me feel powerful, makes me feel empowered, and makes me feel like things are right with the world. I truly cherish the ability to do that, to give to others and take care of, help, assist others. I have distinct memory of days that I left work and felt like, sounds cheesy, but it's true, like my heart was going to burst with happiness because of my ability to help another person that day, right? Hopefully you know what that feels like too. And, without good balance, it is the thing that takes from me the most. And it is a thing that I can come to resent, right? So it's this important distinction here, that sacrificing myself or ourselves in order to care for others isn't justifiable, that's really the line there, right? And when it crosses that line, that is when the inherent purpose, I think, associated with it, at least for me, kind of pales or shifts or exits the picture entirely. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this feels. Again, lots of you probably in the audience have heard about these topics, so I'm not going to belabor these points. I'm just going to discuss a couple highlighted ones here. And especially for anybody who's sort of new to these concepts, I think it's important to know sort of what does that feel like in my body, in my brain, my head, my heart. And it's probably true that as I read these, some of these will resonate more with you. You'll go, oof, you know? And that's really important, that feeling that you have that goes, ooh, yeah, I know that one, right? Because that is likely to be a cue for you, one of like the kind of light bulb moments, right? Or what are the symptoms that is an early cue that I'm getting depleted. So, and something to watch for. So, pervasive feelings of physical, psychological, and emotional exhaustion, hopelessness, what's the point? It doesn't matter. It's not going to work out anyway. Irritability, low frustration tolerance, reduced compassion, feeling numb is a huge one. Low motivation or activation, like I don't got it. I can't get there. I'm trying and I don't have it. Rumination, so excessive worrying about something. Increased arousal, being like easily activated, amped, or like distressed, right? Like that hairpin trigger kind of a thing. This is one for me. I'm like, ooh. Self-blame or beliefs that you aren't doing enough for the people that you're trying to help or the people that are suffering. Various physical symptoms, a lot of like the same kinds of physical symptoms associated with depression and anxiety. So all those kind of somatic symptoms overlap. Losing touch with your why. That's another one. Like, I thought I knew why I was doing this. I thought I knew what sort of drove me and why I was here, and I don't think about that anymore, or I don't have a good connection to that anymore. Of note, there are assessment tools out there if you're wanting to sort of like self-assess, assess others. If you have any amount of interest in the assessment side of this, this is a heavily researched and utilized one. I put links. At the end, I have a links page for lots of things that I reference. So anyway, it's there if you want it. Okay, what the research says. So, are we being overly dramatic or whiny? And this isn't even a real thing. No. Research says definitely is. Suffice to say, it's exceedingly common across lots of professions and titles and whatnot and life experiences. So I'm going to read a couple. About 45 to 71% of PTs that were polled reported burnout. That was pre-pandemic, folks. What do you think COVID did to that? Right? Half of them now report higher rates of burnout than they did before, and that was a sizable portion before, right? I apologize for any other therapy discipline out there. Apparently, people only study PTs, so we can elaborate, we can extrapolate. 42%, almost half of social workers reported suffering from secondary traumatic stress, basically vicarious trauma. Looking at you girls over there. New employees are heavily exposed to trauma. New employees that are heavily exposed to trauma are at the highest risk. So basically, this comes out of research that shows that people that feel they have low competency in their job, aka predominantly new employees, and are in a high trauma environment, they report the highest burnout rates of any other group, or of any group. So good for us to be aware of for anybody who's new and entering this field, right? About 50% of PTs that were polled pre-pandemic, 2019, said that they were thinking about making a professional change within the next 5 years. Things like reducing their hours or getting out of patient care altogether. Okay? And the top reason, not surprising, to achieve a better work-life balance. COVID, obviously not good for any of this. One notable stat is that they found a 40% increase in burnout amongst non-direct care nursing staff as a result of the pandemic. So these are people that are not even working one-on-one very much or any of their day and still reported that level of increase. So it's very real. Lots more stats, not going to go over those. When we look at the health impacts of burnout and compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, the reality is that it is actually making us ill. It has very profound and real impact on our health. It degrades our health, right? It is associated with increased risk of all of these things. Lots of cardiovascular risk factors, not surprisingly, obesity, type 2 diabetes, various GI issues, weakened immune response, addiction issues. Okay. So I'm going to go over a couple real world examples that may kind of ring true to you as you hear them, if this hasn't already. Okay. Do these sound familiar? They can't do it without me. If I prioritize what I need, I'll be letting everyone down. My coworkers or boss probably think I'm slacking off. I feel like my tank is empty and I have nothing left to give. So, can anyone in this room say that they have never had these thoughts? Raise your hand if you've never had these thoughts. Oh God, I was hoping that somebody would. Be like, tell me your secrets, man. Who are you, you little enigma? Okay, darn it. All right, some other things. Not allowing yourself to take time off, talking yourself out of taking time off, or feeling guilty when you do. Sounding familiar? I'm bad at the last one. I've gotten far enough to do it and prioritize it more, but I feel guilty when I do it. Still there. Frequently thinking about work when you're off. Engaging in work tasks while taking PTO, like taking calls, texts, checking email. Last one, how often do you take time off that isn't for appointments, medical stuff, family events that you need to be at, sick kiddos, or other adulting things, like buying a new house, doing your taxes, meeting the roofing guy? If the answer is not very often, you are not alone in that. It is not very frequent within the stuff that we do as professionals. Okay, risk factors. So there are various risk factors that likely make a person more susceptible to burnout. This is just one such list. It's not the Bible, but they do make a lot of sense, and they are hard to argue with when we go over them. And as I go over these, I do so from the most loving, non-judgmental place of been there, done that, probably still doing it. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, working longer hours, not delegating, not allowing yourself to take breaks, not saying no. That's a big one. Bottling things up, avoiding, perfectionism, taking work home, lack of boundaries. This is essentially having poor definition between what's okay and what's not okay. Not sharing with others. This is often driven by feelings of shame, right? About what we perceive as shortcomings or issues or challenges that we have. So we don't open up, we don't share, we don't tell people about it, right? Which avoids vulnerability. And vulnerability is what? Are you guys Brene Brown lovers? I see some nods, yes. Vulnerability is basically the main way that we get support when we need help. And number two, it is how we foster deeper connection with other human beings. So by not sharing, we essentially don't get the help we need, and we don't get any closer with people, or maybe even get less close with people. Womp womp, not good, right? Shame, vulnerability, that stuff is really key and big underpinnings to all of this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The final risk factor, kind of for those that find themselves like squeezing out their hobbies, this is basically giving yourself messages like, I don't get to do that, I don't deserve to have that, I haven't gotten enough done today to let myself do that, I'm not far enough ahead in XYZ in order to take that time. Again, said with the utmost love and non-judgment, many of these characteristics for burnout, right? Many of these kind of like styles, approaches, characteristics that are associated with burnout coincide with this mindset that our status and our self-worth are largely defined by productivity, excessive work, and external measures of success. So this is a quote here from Brene Brown. This isn't from her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, one of her guideposts here, and I just think it's relevant to think about, right, if these things are true, and again, loving kindness, definitely true, of me, right? But where do we go with that? What do we do with that, right? And this is sort of begins to answer that question, sort of how do we start to let go of exhaustion as a status symbol and productivity as self-worth, right? How do we disconnect who I am, what my value and worth from those external things, right? That again, like society says, make up a good person, right? Or mean a heck of a lot. Not easy. You gotta work at that. Okay, so what can we do about it? If you wanna have a fun time, Google search images, puzzled kids. Lot of gems. So we can define these constructs, establish that they really exist, they are real, they're prevalent, they hurt our health, and even identify some things that make us at greater risk for a burnout, right? But the big question is, what the heck do we do about that? And honestly, I'm still very much wading through this and figuring this out, for sure. Again, this is I'm moving into the Lindsay knows less about this part of the presentation. So we're learning together. I'm gonna just at least share with you kind of things I've learned thus far from reading and talking with people that do what all of you guys do. So the cure is not self-care. What? That's crazy. I know that sounds crazy, right? Because there's so much stuff out there about self-care. Let me try to explain. We're inundated with messages like, you have to put on your own oxygen mask first. You can't pour from an empty cup. You have to take care of yourself before you can take care of others, right? I've said these, right? I mean, absolutely. They're well-intended messages, you know? And they aren't entirely false messages either. But when we hear people say them, there's something about them that doesn't ring entirely true sometimes, or even a lot of the time. And even though people say them benevolently, right, they can sometimes come across as cliche or trite or oversimplified. Like, it's just that easy, you know? And depending on the context, they can even feel laden with expectation or guilt sometimes. Does that make sense? Yeah. Kind of this, like, if you're not already doing it, it's probably your fault. And you should probably get on that. You should probably prioritize that. Just do it. Just do it, you know? So, for example, when my husband says, take however much time you need to prep for this presentation, I can almost hear a little nagging voice in the back of my head that says, yes, but, you know, right? And to be fair, my husband was fantastic as he was preparing for this presentation. But it's that yes, but. It's that, are you sure? You know? So why don't these messages ring entirely true when we hear them? Because internally, we don't believe them. Right? Not entirely. These self-care messages ultimately are at odds with our human giver syndrome. For most of you guys that are sitting in the room, maybe not all, but a lot of you probably, right? We've already established you guys have thought these thoughts, you know? And they're at odds with the sort of like moral obligations, duties, expectations that we've kind of been set up and conditioned to believe. It's my job, both personally and professionally, to sacrifice myself in service of others. That's what I do, right? So these messages are at odds with that internal, deep down seated feeling that we have that, like, well, that's just what I'm supposed to do or should do. There's also kind of a logistical problem associated with this too. Like, just go ahead and engage in some self-care when you're super burnt out. That doesn't sound very feasible, right? You know, like, I'm already at my most depleted. I've already told you that, and you're like wanting me to now somehow like come up with and prioritize and engage in these concepts that I've clearly struggling with, you know? The Nagoski sisters would argue that, like, the answer is we can't do this alone. This has to be a group effort. It has to be something that you and your support system like mutually prioritize, right? So they say that your support unit needs to care for your well-being as much as you care for theirs, and that it's imperative you have good communication around the sort of fluctuating needs within that system. So a little bit more about those sisters I keep mentioning in that book. All right. The premise, again, I'm going to do my best of describing this. The premise, there's lots of great ideas, but one of the big premises of this book is that there's a fundamental difference between stress and stressors. So if you're, a way to remember this, if you're a caveman long ago on the savannah, all of a sudden you see a lion in the brush, right? The lion is your stressor, and the stress is all the physiological things that happen in your body to allow you to respond to that lion, right? And of course, that stress response is beautifully created for the environment in which it developed. Caveman days, many years ago, right? Because it gets our body quickly to do the things that we need to do to keep ourselves safe, to keep us alive, right? To do fight, flight, or freeze responses, right? It's great. It's what it's designed to do. Fantastic. And long ago, when this was developing, there was also really good built-in strategies for expelling that stress. all that stuff that happens in your body, all the chemical stuff that occurs, right, that amps you up to respond, there was ways to get rid of that. You were going to fight, physically move your body and fight. You were going to flee, physically move your body and run. And then there's also all kinds of other things. The book talks about sort of the social implications, like if I am escaping danger and I succeed in that, there's likely this big sort of like affection and high social interaction thing that happens with my tribe. So it's just sort of built-in stuff that would help us expel that stress. Nowadays, our stressors are very disassociated, right, from our stress response. Doing my taxes is very different from a lion, right? My body doesn't understand that stressor very well, right? It still causes me stress, though. And there's nothing about that stressor of doing your taxes that sort of forces you to run a mile, right? Or do jumping jacks, or get rid of the stress that's associated with it in any kind of form or fashion. So the argument here really is that basically we are at high risk for being stressed, but then not expelling that stress. And so we kind of store up what they call like incomplete stress cycles. And where are we going to store all that extraneous stress that we haven't been able to expel and get rid of? In our bodies, right? It's going to stick with us. And so we have to find ways to do that, to expel it. And we have to kind of speak its language. If we're going to get rid of that pent-up stress, we have to speak its language, which is body language. It's physically mediated things, very basic, primitive even sort of things that get rid of that. They also talk about this idea that like stress and emotions are tunnels. You have to sort of go through them to get through them. So this idea of like denying the stress or saying it's not happening, you're doing fine, denying distressing emotions, right? Things that like really bother us, hard emotions, loss, grief, anger, rage, whatever. Denying those things, all that's doing is keeping us stuck in this tunnel, in the darkness, in the middle of the tunnel. We have to have a really like acknowledgement of open engagement with, purposeful interaction with these things, calling them what they are, and doing something very logically or purposefully about them in order to get through them. Can't get to the good light at the end of the tunnel if we don't experience that, and we don't allow ourselves to experience it. Also, we can't just relax. They do a lot of myth busting around this, right? So if it was that easy, we would just all be doing that. If it was as easy as like, oh, you mean just flip that switch and I'll just relax? Like, thanks for letting me know and reminding me I had that switch. Cool, done. I wouldn't be up here talking. We wouldn't have this as an issue, right? So it's, again, this sort of like, you have to engage heavily with the thing. Call it what it is and engage with it in order to process it. Also, just of note, if you ever are at a point where you're questioning whether or not we have a difference between stress and stressors, ask yourself, why do we have smash rooms? Right? I'm going to guess that TV did not do anything to that woman. She's smacking the heck out of it. What is she doing? She's not addressing her stressor, certainly, but she's addressing her stress. She's doing a bang-up job of addressing her stress, right? Okay, so hard and fast, tangible things we can do. If we have all these accumulated incomplete stress cycles, how do we get rid of them? Physical activity is your number one. It is your go-to. It's the most primitive one. It's the one that was most associated with this kind of response when it originated back in caveman days, right? Movement. So your body doesn't understand the stress associated with taxes or having a hard interpersonal conversation with a colleague, but it does understand running, swimming, jumping, dancing, right? It understands that. And so that's what we have to do for it to help get rid of that. For those out there that hate exercise, I'm going to get there, guys, I promise, someday. I don't like it very much, though, at all. I was relieved to see that in the book they talk about other methods. So basically, or people out there that like can't exercise due to chronic pain or disability. I do want to do a quick plug, though. Even with lots of physical impairment, there's lots of adaptive ways to be physically active. So, but if for whatever reason you just don't or can't, there's these kind of body-based therapies. So basically, one example of this is that they pair PMR, so progressive muscle relaxation, with vivid imagery of your stressor and kind of taking care of, getting over, annihilating, overcoming that stressor. Breathing, that's the gentlest way to move through the stress cycle. It's nice because you can use it anywhere, and obviously it doesn't take much to do. It's also, though, maybe not highly effective for everybody, right? It might not do enough for you. Some people love it, it's great, that's all they need. Others, absolutely not. If you don't know much about deep breathing, Google it, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm running a long time. Positive social interaction. So when life sucks, when I'm having a bad day, right, and Tong, one of our dietary aides in the kitchen, gives me a hard time, makes me laugh, I feel better. Even didn't do anything for what's going on with me that day. I still have all the same stressors I had before, right? They're just waiting for me in my office. They're not far away. But I feel better, right? That little, but seemingly small positive interactions, they help our brain remember that people are good and the world is safe and things are sane, at least momentarily. Big ol' cry. This is just cathartic, right? If you feel tears welling up, this is literally your body asking to complete the stress cycle. So we need to let it. We need to let it do that. And then if we do that around other people, if we have a big ol' cry around other people, we get through that. What often comes right after? Laughter. Think of our discharge parties at On With Life. Some of them are highly emotional and moving, and we're all, you know. And then we quickly move to a joke, and we're laughing together, right? Which is another, thankfully, way to move through the stress cycle. Big, deep, kind of like belly laughter kinds of things. Research says that activates a really primitive part of our circuitry that is related to making and maintaining social bonds. Creative expression is yet another. Affection, I won't talk. There's so many cool things to talk about with all of this, so I won't get to all of it, you guys. But I would highly suggest this book. Read, do the thing. Affection is really big. I do want to hit that one. So the Gottmans are famous, like relationship researchers. It's a couple, a married couple. They talk about a 6-second kiss with your partner, right? It's really hard to kiss someone for 6 seconds if you hate them. Right? Or you resent them. You know, it pushes past that stuff. And it also is this very like purposeful, intentional physical affection. Like I'm devoting a space and a time, 6 seconds, just 6 seconds, but to be present with you, present with another person in a high level of physical affection, right? So then the Nagoski sisters talk about this in another facet, which is a 20-second hug. That seems long, right? Maybe awkwardly, probably awkwardly long, right? But it's important. It's along the same lines, the same logic, right? And the idea here is that you're going to sort of, it doesn't have to be exactly 20 seconds, but you're going to hug, stay in a sustained hug until you feel your body relax, until you feel a shift in that energy and a downregulation of the stress. And we all kind of know that, right? Because most hugs we do are just like, and move on with your day. And it's distinctly different for those ones in your life. You can probably think of ones where you just stayed. And eventually there's that, that's what you want to get to. Okay, notice that none of these strategies are very or really at all cognitively related, like cognitively mediated. They aren't. So I think it's important to note that dealing with our stress is not a cognitive thing, really. It's not. It's a body thing, right? It's not to say that cognitive strategies aren't important. They are helpful. I think the book really talks about they're helpful in dealing with our stressor, but we have to deal with the stress first before we can adequately or effectively deal with our stressor, right? And so you kind of maintain those cognitive strategies, which they list and talk about lots of good ones, for dealing with your stressor in a more relaxed, de-stressed body. Then those things come into play. Okay, Miss Brene Brown. We're going to switch gears, talk about another beautiful mind. She's brilliant in a million things, but for the purposes of my talk today, I'm going to highlight some of what I view as sort of like foundational concepts to our psychological wellness and kind of how do we continue to grow as an individual, all of which can be protective factors against burnout. So Brene's written lots of books. Again, the one that I'm highlighting today is called The Gifts of Imperfection. In this book, she developed 10 guideposts to help in kind of the pursuit of what she calls wholehearted living. And of those 10 guideposts, I pulled out 2 that I think are probably like crucially relevant to burnout. So they are, this will sound familiar, letting go of exhaustion as a status symbol and productivity as self-worth, and cultivating play and rest. Doesn't that sound lovely? Next one, letting go of perfectionism and cultivating self-compassion. So she believes that perfectionism really exists on a continuum. It's not to say that like some people are perfectionists and some aren't. Really, we all have some amount of this. For some people, it's only going to come out when they're very vulnerable, very depleted or stressed, right? And then way at the other far end of the spectrum, there's people for whom this is immensely chronic, almost compulsive, and she even equates it to like something similar to like an addiction, right? So I think this sort of recognizing in ourselves, if this resonates with you, if this quote resonates with you, if who I am relies solely on what I produce, how hard I work, how much I achieve, or how perfect I am, that is likely to be a recipe for immense unhappiness, right? That sounds daunting, unachievable, right? Demoralizing, frankly, right? And so I think it's that sort of looking at how much do I have those things, when do they pop up for me, and what do I do about that? Here's this guy. Here's her other 8 guideposts. Again, great book, just highly suggest reading it. Here's this guy, I didn't know where else to put him. It is my plug for The Saying is Important. So over the last several months, there's been, as I said, some really just tough emotional things that have happened in Almouth life, and this is something I knew, but it's become increasingly solidified in my mind, how important the saying is, right? That having the opportunity, the space, and the acceptance to say the thing out loud, either to yourself or preferably to another human, is crucially important for us moving through the stress cycle and moving through those difficult emotions. The not saying is really destructive, frankly. And if you can do that to another person, even better if what you can get on the other side is, I hear you. That makes sense. That is a reasonable way to feel. You're allowed to feel that way. And I've been there. Whew, right? Immense weight off when we get that. Huge for positive social interaction. Huge for expelling stress from our body. Okay? So if you ever hear from someone, I don't want to hear about that, I want to talk about that, you can say the saying is important. Lindsay said so. Suffice to say, obviously we've talked about this in the context of work, but heavily outside of work as well. if within an organization, to have support and have a culture that sort of adopts these things, recognizes these things, is huge, immense, right? One key point, I think, is boundaries. Boundaries. This is, Brene Brown talks about this, and she adopted it from somebody else, and I don't remember who, apologies, but a simplistic way of knowing, like, what is boundaries? What's making or establishing boundaries? It is teaching people or establishing what is okay and what is not okay. Because in reality, we have to teach people how to treat us. We do. We're doing it all the time anyway, right? All the things I'm doing day to day in my interactions with people are teaching them something about me and how to treat me or what to expect of me or what's okay to expect of me. So I better be teaching them the right things, right? Or better if I can make sure that what I'm teaching them is in line with what I actually think is reasonable, okay? And that's really what boundaries are. Huge. Okay, nuggets to take with you. Learn your top signs of burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. What are they for you, right? Work on identifying those and acknowledging them when they happen, right? Say the thing. I'm feeling burnout. Oh man, I have a hairpin trigger. Here I go. I got called on it a couple of weeks ago, right? Acknowledge when it's there. Doesn't help us to avoid and not say. Ask others for what you need, both personally and professionally. Identify your most effective ways to complete the stress cycle. Have a couple backups. You can't do jumping jacks in every, scenario of life to expel your stress. It's not going to work. So have a couple that you can use that work for you. There'll be some that you like, your body likes more than others. Then build those strategies into your daily and weekly routine. And then ultimately, I know it probably sounds kind of corny, but thinking about, taking to heart, giving yourself time to mull on sort of, what does this mean about my own journey of vulnerability, authenticity, and learning to kind of love and nurture the person that I am. Keep me moving forward, right? All right. Links are on the PowerPoint, and that's it. Thank you, guys. I know I'm over time. If there's any pressing questions, I suppose yell them out, but thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.